Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to Victober, and today I'm going to give you a recommendation for every year of the Victorian period. So, happy Victober. Today is the first day of Victober. If you don't know what Victober is, I'll leave down below my announcement video and the announcement videos of the other hosts. But it is a month-long readathon that takes place every October, all about reading and celebrating Victorian literature. And to kick off Victober this year, I thought I would give you a recommendation from each year of the Victorian period. So a couple of years ago, I said to myself, oh, it would be really fun if I tried to read a book from every year of the Victorian period. And so I looked through my list of all the books that I'd read from the Victorian period to see what gaps I had. And I think at that time I had like 2 gaps. There were 2 years from the Victorian period I hadn't read anything from. So anyway, I filled in those gaps and I thought it might be fun to give you a recommendation for every year of the Victorian period. I'm obviously going to go through these recommendations quite quickly, but I thought it might be a fun video nonetheless. So the rules I set for myself for recommending a book from every year in the Victorian period was that I would only pick one book from every year, and that I would pick something that was published in volume form that year rather than something that was being serialized that year. So those were the kind of parameters I set myself, and I have mostly kept to those parameters with a few little exceptions. I also tried to select books that would give me like quite a mix of authors. So there were many years that I had read several books from. I think my most read year in the Victorian period is 1863, which I had read 9 books from, but there were also I think 6 years that I had read 8 books from. So there were some years where I had a very, very difficult choice. At the same time, there were some years, especially in the early Victorian period, that I hadn't read many books from. And the first like 10 years of the Victorian period, the first 10 recommendations I have for you are very heavily Charles Dickens dominated. There were just quite a few years in the 1830s and 40s where the only books I had read were by Charles Dickens, but that's fine. I'll start off at the beginning in the first year of the Victorian period, 1837, with The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This is a wonderful, hilarious, episodic novel about Mr. Pickwick and his friends travelling around England and getting into lots of scrapes. It is really, really good fun. From 1838, the book I would like to recommend to you is Oliver Twist. Yes, I did say it would be quite Dickens dominated at the beginning of this video. Oliver Twist is a interesting social critique novel and coming of age story about a little boy called Oliver who grows up in the workhouse and everything that happens to him. It is not my favourite Dickens book. It's probably my least favourite Dickens book, but it is the only book I have read from 1838. From 1839, I would like to recommend to you Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau, a wonderful social critique domestic realism novel about 2 sisters moving to a new town. For 1840, I'd like to recommend Michael Armstrong, The Factory Boy by Frances Trollope, mother of Anthony Trollope, who we'll talk about plenty later. Michael Armstrong, The Factory Boy is a novel all about the life of children working in factories in the 1830s and 40s, and it was actually a really pivotal novel in bringing about the Factory Acts and limiting like the hours children could work in factories. Really interesting novel, really worth your time. From 1841, I'd like to recommend you Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, a wonderful historical novel set during the Gordon riots of the 1780s. It is truly fantastic, a really underrated Dickens novel, full of drama and really kind of about prejudice and intolerance and how that breeds violence, and it's just a fantastic, truly wonderful book. From 1842, I'd like to recommend you American Notes by Charles Dickens. This book is a work of non-fiction all about Charles Dickens' time in America. I found it really, really interesting, and it is the only book I have read from 1842. From 1843, I would like to recommend you A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is a wonderful Christmas novella about a man called Ebenezer Scrooge being visited by some ghosts who teach him how to be a better person, and it is truly magnificent. From 1844, I'd like to recommend you Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens, a wonderful, adventurous, sweeping novel that follows partly an old man called Martin Chuzzlewit who doesn't know which of his horrible family members to leave his money to, and also his grandson, young Martin Chuzzlewit, who is determined to make his fortune. The reign of Charles Dickens is now over. There will now be a much bigger variation in the authors that I have to recommend. From 1845, I would like to recommend you Night and Morning by Edward Bulwer Lytton, a wonderful coming-of-age story following a young man who is disinherited after his father's death and everything that happens to him. From 1846, I want to recommend you Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, which is the collection of poetry the Bronte sisters published in 1846. I really love the Bronte sisters' poetry. I think it is really, really fantastic. And when I told you that the reign of Dickens was over, what I didn't tell you is that the reign of the Brontes was just beginning for the next few years. So now we come to 1847, and I had a real trouble with 1847 because two of my favourite novels of all time were published in 1847, and I found it really hard to pick between them, so I didn't. So for 1847, I would like to recommend you Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which is a fantastic, dark, twisty-turny, weird novel about lots of horrible people getting revenge on each other. And I'd also like to recommend you Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Emily's sister. Jane Eyre is a wonderful buildings-romance, coming-of-age story about a governess called Jane Eyre who ends up working at somewhere called Thornfield Hall, where things are not quite what they seem. I just love both these books so much that I really felt like I couldn't choose between them. And then I had another problem with the year of 1848, where two of my other favourite novels were published, so again I thought I would just recommend both of them to you. So I wanted to recommend, you know, still on the Brontes, The Tenant of Wildfire Hall by Anne Bronte, a fantastic proto-feminist novel about a man called Gilbert who meets a widow called Mrs. Graham, who seems to have some dark secrets in her past, and he ends up finding out more about her life and her marriage, and it's just a fantastic, fantastic book. But I also wanted to recommend The Half-Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury, a wonderful novel about two half-sisters who don't know of each other's existence, one of whom is middle class, one of whom is working class. These two books are two of the best proto-feminist Victorian books that are out there, so I couldn't resist recommending them both. And then for 1849, I wanted to recommend Shirley by Charlotte Bronte, which is a wonderful sort of semi-industrial novel about a woman called Caroline, and later on in the novel, her friendship with another woman called Shirley. This is a really great book, definitely one I recommend. Okay, the reign of the Brontes is now over. For 1850, I want to recommend Olive by Dinah Mullock-Craik, a fantastic coming-of-age story about a young girl called Olive who is born with curvature in her spine, told that she therefore isn't going to get married and have kids and live the life that most Victorian women do, and therefore she becomes an artist, and we just kind of follow her in her life as she takes a slightly different path. Really fantastic book, really recommend it. For 1851, I want to recommend London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew. This is the only book I'm recommending in this video that I haven't finished yet. I am about a third of the way through this collection of essays and articles from the Victorian period about life for people living in London in poverty in the Victorian period. I have read in full and finished other books from 1851, but I just didn't like any of them or think any of them were as interesting as London Labour and the London Poor, so I thought I would recommend this instead. And now we come to the year of 1852. Now I have only read one book from 1852, and that was Basil by Wilkie Collins, and I really didn't like this. This is one of my least favourite Wilkie Collins books. It's one of his very early books, and basically he writes in a really sensational style, which, you know, fits his later books where dramatic things happen but nothing dramatic happens, and it just wasn't good. So I thought instead I would also recommend you another book that, while it was not published in volume form in 1852, was being serialised for the whole of 1852 because it was being serialised from 1851 to 1853, and that is Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, which is a delightful episodic comic novel focusing on a small town called Cranford where all the kind of wealthy people are women, and it's just about their community, and it's great. For 1853, I want to recommend you The Heir of Redcliffe by Charlotte Mary Young, a really interesting novel about a family and their complicated relationship with their cousin, the Heir of Redcliffe. Sort of domestic realism meets tragedy, maybe. A really interesting read. And then from 1854, I want to recommend Hard Times by Charles Dickens, a really interesting industrial novel looking at the kind of industrialisation of the mind and how industrialisation and a reliance on machines might affect how society and people operate. From 1855, I want to recommend North and South, one of my favourite books of all time. This is by Elizabeth Gaskell, and it is, again, an industrial novel. Think Pride and Prejudice, but with an industrial setting, and it's just fantastic and beautiful and amazing, and I love it so much. Possibly my second favourite book of all time. For 1856, I want to recommend Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. This is a novel in verse that is a coming-of-age story all about a young woman called Aurora Leigh who grows up wanting to be a writer, and it's about her experiences, and it's just a really great read. For 1857, I want to recommend The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands by Mary Seacole. This is a non-fiction book, an autobiography / memoir, I guess, by Mary Seacole, partly about her work as a nurse during the Crimean War. If you don't know about Mary Seacole, she is a really kind of significant figure in British history, so it's just a really really interesting book and one I definitely recommend. For 1858, I'd like to recommend My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell, which is a really interesting novella about this imposing figure, Lady Ludlow, and the people kind of in her orbit, I suppose. For 1859, I'd like to recommend The Semi-Detached House by Emily Eden, which is a novel about two families who end up living in, you know, two halves of a semi-detached house, and kind of about their interactions. For 1860, I want to recommend The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, a fantastic sensation novel following a lot of different characters and a lot of different mysteries. This is a really atmospheric novel. I feel like its premise is too complicated to explain in this video, but I promise you it is well worth a read. For 1861, I want to recommend another sensation novel, East Lynne by Ellen Wood, which is a fantastic, gripping novel. There's murder, there's adultery, there's divorce, there's so much going on in this novel, and it is really fantastic and worth your time. For 1862, another sensation novel. The 1860s were very much the time of sensation novels. I wanted to recommend Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, a fantastic novel about a woman called Lady Audley who has a secret, and the people who are trying to find out what that secret might be. It's really twisty and turny, really great, and I love Robert Audley, one of the central characters. For 1863, I want to recommend The House by the Churchyard by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, a great work of historical fiction set in the 18th century about just a lot of drama. There's just an awful lot of drama in The House by the Churchyard. The book begins with this kind of prologue where someone is digging up a body in a graveyard and they find a skull with lots of unusual wounds to it. And then the rest of the novel is kind of about how that person ended up with such unusual wounds to the head, which I feel like tells you quite a lot about The House by the Churchyard. It is so good. From 1864, I want to recommend The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope. This is the 5th book in the Chronicles of Barsetshire, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading it unless you've read the first 4 books in the series, because they do all like spoil each other, but it is so good. This is one of my favourite Anthony Trollope books, one of my favourite books of all time. The wonderful story of two sisters, Belle and Lily, and their romantic relationships, their very different sentiments and their lives, and it's just so good. And I just love this book so much. But not as much as I love the next book from 1865, which is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, my favourite book of all time. A sweeping, epic novel about money and love and London and the River Thames, and it is just the best. What more can I say? It is the best, and you should all read it. Though I have to say, the book from 1866 is a really fantastic book as well. The 1860s were an excellent decade of Victorian literature, and from 1866 I want to recommend you Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, a wonderful coming-of-age story and love story and family story about a girl called Molly and what happens after her father remarries, and she suddenly has this stepsister and stepmother in her life. It is such a fantastic, wonderful book, possibly Elizabeth Gaskell's masterpiece. Squire Hamley is possibly the best written character in all of literature, in my opinion. It is so good. What a few years in literature. That is 3 of my favourite novels of all time, like top 10 favourite books of all time in a row. And then for 1867, another fantastic novel is The Last Chronicle of Barset, which is, you know, the book that follows on from The Small House of Allington as the last chronicle in the Barsetshire Chronicles. I do not think this is worth reading unless you have read the previous 5 books, because you won't get the same out of it, but it is so fantastic. Such a great novel, pulling together all of these different characters that you've come to love over time, with its new plots as well, set between Barsetshire and London, looking at the differences between town and country life, and it's just so good. And then 1868, another fantastic book, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, a wonderful mystery surrounding the disappearance of a diamond, told through lots of different really interesting perspectives in a really unusual form. This is such a good book. My favourite probably by Wilkie Collins. And then for 1869, I want to recommend Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. It has been a good 16 years since I read this, but I really loved it as a teenager. It is a really kind of wild story about warring families and 2 people from these warring families who fall in love. A bit of a Romeo and Juliet feel to it. Then for 1870, I want to recommend Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins, another of his greats. Really fantastic, pacey, gripping novel looking at the inequalities and unfairness in marriage law, and especially the oddities of Scottish marriage law, which makes it sound much less gripping than it is. It is exceptionally tense, and Geoffrey Delamain is just like, what a terrifying gloriously created character. For 1871, I want to recommend the first Thomas Hardy on this list, and that is Desperate Remedies, which is kind of Thomas Hardy's take on a sensation novel. It is gripping and pacey with lots of interesting, strange things happening, and we're following a young woman and kind of the odd things that happen in her life. For 1872, I want to recommend Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, which is a vampiric and surprisingly gay novella, and it is really good. For 1873, I want to recommend Tales of Christmas Eve, or The Twilight Stories by Rhoda Broughton, which is a collection of kind of ghostly short stories, which I really enjoyed. For 1874, I want to recommend Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. It's a great novel about Bathsheba Everdeen, who takes over her uncle's farm after he passes away and is beset by 3 very different suitors. It is such a fantastic book and a really good place to start with Thomas Hardy. For 1875, I want to recommend The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, another of my favourite books of all time. Another of my favourite Anthony Trollope books, probably my favourite, possibly joint with The Small House at Allington. This is a very long novel, all about money and all about a bunch of characters drawn together by this fortune belonging to a man called Mr. Melwatch, who has kind of come out of nowhere, and it's just such a great book. For 1876, I want to recommend Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. George Eliot is not my favourite author, but Daniel Deronda is my favourite book by her, and it is a really interesting tale of 2 people, Gwendolyn and Daniel Deronda, who are kind of drawn together. The book kind of looks at marriage and the position of women, and also looks at the Jewish community in the Victorian period, and it is really worth a read. Definitely the George Eliot book that I like the most. For 1877, I want to recommend The American Senator by Anthony Trollope, which is a really interesting novel following lots of different characters in complicated marital and romantic situations. One of the characters is an American senator, but I won't lie, he's not the main character. I don't really know why the book is called that, but it is a great book. For 1878, I want to recommend The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy, another wonderful Thomas Hardy book. This book is all about various people who live on this place called Egdon Heath, which is this really atmospheric, kind of empty, barren place. There is a bit of a love pentagon, I guess, let's say, and is such a great book. Diggory Venn has my heart. What a wonderful character. For 1879, I want to recommend The Egoist by George Meredith, which is all about a woman who becomes engaged to a man that she soon realises she doesn't want to marry. And this long book is all about her efforts to disentangle herself from that engagement and just how hard it is because of the power dynamics between men and women in the Victorian period. This is possibly the most difficult Victorian book I've read in terms of the language, but it is so worth it and it is so good. I love this book so much. For 1880, I want to recommend The Rebecca Rioter by Amy Dilwyn, a really interesting novel about the relationship between classes in 19th century Wales, looking at real historical events in a really interesting way. Then for 1881, I want to recommend another Anthony Trollope book. Yes, there is a lot of Anthony Trollope in this video, and that is Dr. Wirtle's School, which is a wonderful and very surprisingly short Anthony Trollope book about a moral dilemma, I guess, let's say, and it is so good, and I just really, really love it. I think this is a great place to start with Anthony Trollope too, because it is a lot shorter than most of his books. Then we come to 1882, and I've read a few books from 1882, but I didn't really love any of them. So the one I'm going to mention, just because I don't have anything else by this author, is Wooden Tony and the Wooden Doll by Lucy Clifford, which is a collection of 2 short stories, which are kind of like fairy tales, children's fairy tales. I didn't love any of these stories, but Wooden Tony is quite interesting to look at. From a kind of like academic perspective, I guess, rather than an enjoyment perspective, because some people have said that the main character in Wooden Tony is maybe meant to be autistic, and that is quite interesting to look at from a modern perspective, but didn't necessarily love it. So in order to make up for the lack of good books from 1882, I thought I would recommend 2 from 1883, because it was another year where I really struggled to pick between 2 books by 2 fantastic authors who I don't have elsewhere on this list. So I'm going to recommend you both of them. So first I want to recommend Hester by Margaret Oliphant, which is a wonderful feminist novel about a woman called Hester who wants to do more with her life, and her complex and kind of fraught relationship with her aunt, Catherine, who runs a bank. Isn't that cool? Such a great book. But also from 1883 is A Struggle for Fame by Charlotte Riddell, a wonderful novel about various people trying to make it as writers in the Victorian period, looking at how difficult it was to make it as a writer, especially if you're a woman. And it's just such a great book. So two wonderful novels from 1883. For 1884, I want to recommend you Jill by Amy Dilwyn, a wonderful and surprisingly gay novel about a girl called Jill. Jill is so rebellious in every way and is just completely the opposite of what Victorian women were meant to be. It's just this wonderful proto-feminist crazy adventure, and I just love it a lot. For 1885, I want to recommend you After London or Wild England by Richard Jefferies, which is a strange book about a future where civilization has kind of collapsed and nature has taken over, and we've also kind of returned to the feudal times. It's a weird book, but it's really interesting. And then from 1886, I want to recommend Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, a really interesting novella that has obviously entered popular culture quite a lot, about a man called Dr. Jekyll who sometimes turns into a slightly different man called Mr. Hyde. It is very thematically fascinating and really interesting to read. For 1887, I want to recommend A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which is the first of the Sherlock Holmes books. We meet Dr. Watson and his new flatmate, Sherlock Holmes, and it's just a really interesting beginning to Sherlock Holmes. In general, I prefer the short stories to the novels, but I've ended up going for other books for the years that they came out, but I did want to have a Sherlock Holmes in here because I do really enjoy him as a character, and A Study in Scarlet is definitely worth your time. Then for 1888, I want to recommend The Romance of a Shop by Amy Levy, which is a really interesting proto-feminist novel, very short, about a group of sisters who decide to open a photography shop together and how that goes for them. Then for 1889, I want to recommend The Netherworld by George Gissing, which is a fantastic and very miserable novel about the poor in London and how difficult life is, but it's also so good, and there's like glimmers of hope between all the misery, and it's very like Thomas Hardy but urban, and it's just so good. Like, it's so good. It really, really is so fantastic. Then from 1890, I want to recommend News from Nowhere by William Morris, a really interesting like socialist utopian novel where the main character wakes up in a future socialist utopian world. It is quite basic in terms of its plot, but the ideas that it is dealing with are really interesting. Then for 1891, I want to recommend The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which is a fantastic, sinister, wonderful, clever novel about a young man called Dorian Gray who wants to stay young forever and therefore makes some kind of pact where his painting grows old and he does not. And it's both exceptionally sinister and exceptionally witty, and I really recommend it. Then for 1892, I want to recommend Gloriana or the Revolution of 1900 by Florence Dixie, which is a novel from 1892 about a feminist revolution taking place in 1900, and it is just fantastic and fascinating. It is both really like revolutionary and radical in the ideas that it is dealing with in terms of gender, but also it is like a sensation novel in terms of its plot, and it's really, really pacey. I would just so recommend it. I thought it was fantastic. And then from 1893, I want to recommend another really interesting Victorian feminist novel, and that is The Odd Women by George Gissing, which is a book looking at various female characters trying to make their way in the world. One chooses marriage, but many of the other characters are single, trying to earn a living for themselves. And it's just a really interesting novel in terms of the way that it looks at women's rights in the Victorian period. Then from 1894, I want to recommend a play, and that is The Case of Rebellious Susan by Arthur Henry Jones, which is a play about a woman who, after her husband has an affair, decides that she ought to be able to have an affair too, so she does, and that's what the play is about, and it is really great. Then from 1895, I want to recommend The Young Pretenders by Edith Henrietta Fowler. This is a children's book about two little children who like to play games of make-believe and what happens when they're kind of staying with their aunt and uncle for a time. It's just a real sweet joy, and I really, really love this one. From 1896, I want to recommend some poetry. I want to recommend A Shropshire Lad by A.E. Housman, which is a really great collection of poetry, some of which are quite kind of nostalgic, some of which are about kind of Shropshire and landscape. It's also quite interesting because I feel like it's a collection that a lot of people think of as like Edwardian or World War One, because it was really popular during World War One, and because quite a lot of the poems are about war, but actually it was written in the 1890s, 2 decades before the First World War. So that's another interesting thing about it too. And then for 1897, I want to recommend The Beth Book by Sarah Grand, another wonderful Victorian feminist novel, which is a coming-of-age story all about the character of Beth. And it is quite a long book, but it is just so fully realised. Like, Beth as a character is so completely psychologically real, and the way way the book looks at her from, you know, birth to adulthood and how her mind develops is just fantastic. For 1898, I want to recommend The War of the World by H.G. Wells, a Victorian science fiction novel about the invasion of the Martians. It's been quite a long time since I read The War of the Worlds, but it is a really interesting novel, especially if you're interested in science fiction. Then from 1899, I want to recommend Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. It has been a good 12-13 years since I read Heart of Darkness. I studied it at university, but I don't remember it very well. But I did think it was really interesting and I did want to include it. Joseph Conrad was born in Ukraine to Polish parents, but he moved to Britain as a young man and lived the rest of his life in Britain, wrote in English, so I always consider him a Victorian author. Heart of Darkness is a really interesting anti-imperial, anti-colonial novel about the brutality of colonialisation in the Congo. Obviously it was written in the late 19th century, so while it is an anti-imperial book, it's also like anti-imperial within the context of its time and within the limitations of its time. So that is worth being aware, like go into it with an awareness of the history, but it is still a really interesting book. As I said, been a long time since I read it, but I did find it fascinating when I studied it at university. Then for 1900, I want to recommend Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells, a wonderful work of realist fiction, not science fiction this time, about a man called Mr. Lewisham. He's from the kind of upper working classes and he's trying really, really hard to be middle class. He's trying really hard to embrace social mobility, to move up the social scale, but his romantic relationships sometimes are holding him back, and it's kind of about the tension between love and money, and it's just such a wonderful book. And then finally we come to the last year of the Victorian period, 1901. I ummed and ahed about whether or not to include a book for this year because Queen Victoria did die like really near the beginning of 1901, so like most of 1901 was not in the Victorian period, but I did pick a book that was published in volume form later in 1901 but did start serialisation in 1900, so like was definitely being published in the Victorian period, and that is Kim by Rudyard Kipling. This, a bit like Heart of Darkness, is definitely one to go into with an awareness of the historical context and like knowing that it was a book written a long time ago. Kim is set in India and it's about a young boy who is British but has grown up in India, kind of considers himself more Indian than British, and it's about his kind of coming of age story and his experiences. As I said, a book to go into with the historical context of kind of imperialism in India at this point in time in mind, but it is a really interesting novel, especially if you're interested in the history of Britain and India. So there we go. That is a recommendation for every year of the Victorian period. I feel like I have been talking for a very long time and very fast, so we will see how this video has turned out, but I have wanted to do this for a while and I thought it would be a fun thing to do. Welcome to Victober. I hope you have a good time reading lots of amazing Victorian books, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. So first, let's talk about Hester, which is a wonderful novel by Margaret Elephant. That's not her name.